So hello, everyone, and welcome to our CIT webinar today. I'm Emily Lidgate, and I'm one of the sort of theme leaders of CITP and on the management team. So I'm really happy to welcome all of you here. And I'm also really happy to introduce our speakers. So today we have Coree Brown Swan and Viviane Gravey. I'm not going to call you Viviane Gravey. That's my best attempt. From Queen's University Belfast, and I believe both of them identify as political scientists. And they're going to be talking about the UK internal market. And I think there's a couple of reasons why I'm particularly excited about this as a CITP seminar. And the first one is, we're a Center for Inclusive Trade Policy, and this seems to be an issue that's, very much at the heart of that research agenda. How is trade happening between UK nations? And Viviane is also on the sort of management team of CITP, and we have a whole research agenda around this issue. So I consider this webinar to be the official kickoff of us starting to approach that issue collectively. And the other reason why I'm quite excited about this is because the UK has obviously reconfigured its internal market quite dramatically post Brexit, and I think for me, I'm seeing this as an opportunity to sort of reflect on what's actually happening in practice now. What are the big issues, and how are these new systems functioning or not functioning? So with that, I think I'm going to hand over, and I believe Viviane, you're kicking off, correct?
Yes, I am. I'm just going to be sharing some slides. And that should be now seeing my slides. To confirm if that's not the case, do let me know. Thank you very much, Emily, for the introduction and for the warning that this is also the official start of our many projects on this. We will have a very busy summer and next few years ahead. So this is hopefully a bit of an interactive seminar. Webinar. So Coree and I are in the same institutions. We both work on this topic from quite different angles. And so we thought this was not only a good moment to kind of start thinking at this as part of CITP, but also within Queen's, I guess, for us to start thinking about this. This was not our plan. Our plan was to have a webinar this month on the Retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Bill. Now, those of you who have been following the Retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Bill saga will know that it was a plan to have sunset for all retained EU law in the UK of the end of this December, and at which point any pieces of retained EU law that hadn't been saved, basically officially directly saved by the government, would have been cut. So there was huge concerns around regulatory certainty, and we were going to talk about, how does deregulation kind of challenges and risk potentially feeds tension on the UK internal market. Now, what we are hearing from the ministers today and yesterday is that, a lot of these plans are on hold. We're not going to get a sunset. We're going to get a list of 600 pieces of EU legislation. So it's very likely that as CITP, we will come back on this. But I think we're going to wait until the bill comes back to Parliament next week before we talk more about the Retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Bill or the Brexit Freedom Bill. So instead, what we're talking about today is what would have been challenged a lot by that bill, which is the operation of the UK internal market and how regulatory divergence and the fact that different parts of the UK can make policy affect the running and the actual practical functioning of the internal market. And to talk about this, I always come back to this image from the Welsh Assembly Library, because 2017 was not the Senate yet. And they did this brief on Brexit and Welsh devolution, where they presented it how, until Brexit, Welsh policy was constrained by this kind of framework of EU law. Brexit would break that framework free, away. And there was different potential paths. Would we get a free Welsh blob of, policy, unconstrained and just independent Welsh policy? would we get a UK, like Westminster kind of constraint replacing that EU constraint over what Wales could do? Or would we get this kind of four-way Northern Ireland, England, Wales, and Scotland working together to create that framework that would not only constrain Wales, but would constrain the other part of the UK? And we're still kind of always going back to, okay, so what kind of constraint? And, are we going to have that kind of general constraint that sets the margins of maneuver for the different governments? Is it going to be the same margins of maneuver for the UK government or for the devolved administrations, and also for the different devolved administrations? So we're back at this, and I guess for us, trying to make sense of the UK internal market, we have to ask ourselves a few questions when we're trying to kind of look at it. The first is, okay, think back to that kind of constraint around that Welsh blob. Is it a unilateral Westminster imposed constraint? And that's the example of the UK Internal Market Act. Or is it more four administrations working together to create that kind of constraint that would not just bind Wales, but all of them? And that's more the approach of the Common Frameworks. Those of you who are familiar with the Common Frameworks program, or perhaps were a few years back, you remember that for a very long time, especially due to the pandemic, these were coming in very, very slowly. But there's been a whole range of common frameworks that have been published, provisional common frameworks that have been published in recent months. So it does look like there's new energy behind the Common Frameworks program. Another way of looking at it is whether we are talking about common UK policy and like positive integration, where we just agree common policy, all of us together, or whether we just do the other approach, which is negative integration, which just say, well, we may have different policy, but we're just going to assume that English policy should be considered good enough for Wales and vice versa, and also for Scotland and Northern Ireland. So do we just have equivalence between our diverging policies? And finally, all of these questions and that balance that we'll draw between negative and positive, between unilateral and kind of shared approaches, brings us to the question is, of course, we moved away from the EU, but for a very long time, the UK was shaping the EU internal market. So to what extent the UK internal market is now, both in its law and its operation, different from the EU internal market? So we're not going to answer all of these questions today. Hopefully this kind of gives you a flavor for the kind of bigger questions that we're asking ourselves when we consider the UK internal market. And it's still very much, a lot of it is, there's still a lot of question marks there. A lot of the operation of the internal market is still in its infancy, and a lot of the test and the struggles, it took a very long time for the EU internal market to establish itself as it is now, and we cannot expect the UK internal market to just arise overnight and start functioning very clearly. So today we're looking at single-use plastics, and that's for lots of different reasons. First, from an environmental perspective, it really matters. We have a huge problem with marine pollution. A lot of the items that we are seeing in the oceans are actually like marine litter. It's mostly plastic, and a lot of that is the kind of single-use plastic products, such as straws or kind of takeaway containers, plastic bottles. So it does actually really matter from an environmental perspective, these few items. Now that, these are examples on the slides from the Welsh Bill Memorandum, but you can see that from the rationales from the Scottish Act as well, or from the English approach. We are seeing that this is not just a global phenomenon. If we're just looking at our beach in the UK, there is a big problem with plastic litter, and a lot of it is to do with these single-use plastic items. Now, it also matters from a more kind of political science and also law perspective, because the environment is at that kind of overlap between something where the EU had a very big impact, but also is an area of devolved competence. So that question of where power lies and all of that is especially important when it comes to the environment. And because it was one of the earlier power that the devolved administration got, it's also one in which they showed from the 90s onward, from late 90s onward, already different of approaches. So they established their own identity as governments and like doing things differently. Again, going back to Wales, like the Wellbeing of Future Generation Act in 2015 is one of these examples of, okay, we're like in a devolved setting, we don't have to do policy the same way. Now, single-use plastics is also a really interesting case because it was at the heart of that rivalrous emulation fight between Frans Timmermans and Michael Gove back in 2018. So it's been at the heart of who's going to be more ambitious. Is it going to be the UK? Is it going to be the EU? On what? And now what was really interesting around that time when you had that kerfuffle, at the same time in the media, you had Kate Forbes and Nicola Sturgeon from different angle in the Scottish debate saying, we're going to ban single-use plastics and we're going to do it before all of these guys, who were completely ignoring that things were also happening in Wales and Scotland. So today, hopefully, I'm now going to hand in over to Coree. You can see how single-use plastics, it matters a lot for the environment, but it also matters a lot for understanding how the UK is going to work in the future across the foreign administration and how we're going to make our internal market work. And now over to you, Coree.
Great. Thanks, Viviane. If you can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Sorry, Viviane is in charge of all slide movement today. So I come at this from a different perspective, which Viviane began to introduce there, with the idea of and apparently I look at this slide and realize I cannot spell my own name. I've got 3 E's there instead of 2, but hopefully I have something interesting to say about single-use plastics. But I have kind of a niche interest in single-use plastics from the perspective of territorial rather than environmental politics. So I work primarily on the politics of independence union, particularly on Scottish independence, and the impact that the debates over the different unions, the European Union and the UK Union, has had on intergovernmental relations in the UK. And so this interest in this field comes from an interest in the management of an economic union, where I, alongside Nicola McEwen, have looked at federal systems of Canada and Australia to understand, particularly in the arena of environmental policy, how perhaps more progressive, more advanced environmental policies are pursued by the constituent units of a federation. And we see what we've seen in a Scottish and in a Welsh context is that environmental policy over fracking, over plastics, over various policy areas has become an arena for territorial contestation, an arena where you see these kind of contested dynamics over intergovernmental relations or within the forum of intergovernmental relations, but also for nation building. So with the Scottish and Welsh government saying, well, we are more progressive here. We're the first one to do this. Our priority is the environment as a way to distinguish themselves from UK policy areas. So I'll begin by just briefly, and you will know these, but just briefly addressing the market access principles before looking at how this is played out in the UK context. So the UK Internal Market Act is underpinned by 2 market access principles. Firstly, the principle of mutual recognition, that goods or services regulated in one of the constituent territories of the UK can be traded anywhere, and a principle of non-discrimination, which prevents goods produced elsewhere in the UK being treated differently from local goods. This has, and there was significant backlash, there were significant objections to the UK Internal Market Act because of its implications for devolution. It preserves lawmaking autonomy, so legislatures, the devolved parliaments, can legislate on these issues, but it reduces the reach of devolved legislation. So tomorrow, the Scottish Parliament and the Senate could set requirements for certain goods, but without an exemption to the Internal Market Act. Those would only apply for goods produced within their 2 territories. And given the disparities, given the uneven nature and the high degree of internal trade within the UK, that wouldn't work. So something else needed to be done here. Next slide, please. So post-Brexit, we've seen an emphasis on plastics. We've seen this ongoing conversation, ongoing legislation at the EU level, the conversations Viviane alluded to between the UK government and the Scottish government. But we find single-use plastics is quite a useful case study for understanding these territorial dynamics because it's an environmental policy with regulatory implications for goods trade. So how goods are moved throughout the UK internal market. All of the UK's administrations have a policy aim of reducing the use, the production and distribution and eventual washing up on shores and in cities of single-use plastics. But this environmental policy is within devolved competencies in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And we've seen different paces, different priorities, and different paces, which I'll come to on the next slide. There's also an attempt by Scotland and Wales to maintain regulatory alignment with the European Union, with the European Union policies on single-use plastics. We see this really explicitly in the Scottish case because it is part of an Scottish government and SNP government narrative of this is allowing us to return to the EU at some point. By maintaining regulatory alignment, that makes eventual independence and EU membership easier. So there's been a real emphasis on maintaining that alignment, that Scotland looks not to London for its environmental policy, but keeps an eye on what Brussels is doing. And that's a narrative. We can kind of pull apart and tease apart how well that's working in practice, the kind of challenges around EU membership and maintaining that regulatory alignment when the majority of Scotland's trade is with the rest of the UK. But there's an important political narrative there. Next slide. So we can see different policy areas and some of the discussions of levels of ambition, how far they're going. We can see kind of a competition between different actors within the UK and at the EU level as well. Often this refers to quite small things, balloon sticks, for example, but important when we consider the amount of single-use plastics in the environment and the environmental implications of both their production and disposal. But we can see different processes and timelines by which bans have come in the respective territories. And on the next slide, I'll talk you through how exactly that happens in regards to the Internal Market Act. So we see legislation on single-use plastics products, an environmental protection bill in Scotland in 2021, in Wales in 2022. The Scotland legislation largely mirrors EU bans on manufacture and supply. This mirroring reflects a desire for regulatory alignment, this emphasis on regulatory alignment between Scotland and the EU. The Welsh bill is slightly different because it's limited to supply rather than manufacture, but it includes a broader range of products. So we see a greater scope, partially in response to the fact that the manufacturing capacity is quite limited. Northern Ireland, of course, sits as always a bit apart, and is obliged as a result of the protocol to implement this EU directive on single-use plastics, the 2019 directive, but we haven't seen proposals because, of course, we haven't seen that continuity of government or an executive in Northern Ireland. What we found is both these the Scottish and Welsh legislation would, at the surface, or would in principle, violate the UK Internal Market Act because it's placing these additional regulations on goods for sale. But the regulations were exempted via statutory implement laid before the UK Parliament. So basically, the Scottish government, Scottish Parliament, and the Welsh Senate wrote to the Secretary of States, their respective Secretary of States, and said, we're seeking an exemption here. This exemption was granted. However, it was quite tricky, particularly in the Scottish case. We had the bans on those original products around drink stirrers and spoons and things like that came in June last year, and I think it was only in April in which the statutory implement was employed and the necessary agreement was reached between the two governments. It didn't tend to be politicized. It seemed to be a sense of the UK government said, well, why are we rushing this when we're bringing in this as well? Why can't we work together? The Scottish government saying we would like to be more ambitious on this, as they tend to be on environmental policy. But there was a successful as statutory implement, the necessary implements were secured by the UK or by the Scottish government, allowing them to bring in this legislation. But the timing was quite tricky there, and it took quite a while, which could have implications for future environmental policies, future bans on extending the range of products subject to these bans, or other environmental policy when we talk about post-Brexit legislation. Go on ahead to the next slide, please.
That should be the next slide. Is that?
Oh, sorry, I'm not seeing it on my end.
The politics of plastics.
Sorry, no, for some reason there was a bit of a delay there. Okay, so we have the politicization alongside the kind of regulatory, the technical stuff. And I'm clearly like a party politics person. I refer to everything as regulation as the technical stuff. But we have this really interesting political dynamic. And what we find, and there's a few key points here. The first one is that we find the process of agreeing exemptions involved protracted negotiations, despite the fact that both governments were moving towards the same policy. And this can slow the pace of policy development and implementation. And we'll see this on in a minute when we talk about bottle deposit returns as well. So we see a risk that because in order to use their devolved powers, the devolved parliaments have to go and seek an exemption. They have to negotiate with the UK government. And this might not be a priority for the UK government. We can see a risk that this could slow the pace of policy development. The statutory implement is also quite limited. So it's limited to those regulations listed in the original legislation. So if you wanted to add an additional product, if you wanted to add a whole tranche of additional products to the bans on single-use plastics within Scotland or within Wales, you would have to seek a new exemption. There's not kind of a process by which this can be modified. It would need a new exemption. Lisa Whitten and Nicola McEwen have described a situation as kind of a reverse Sewell. So the principle that the Westminster Parliament will not normally legislate in devolved areas without permission. So kind of turning that on their heads, the devolved administrations in some ways have to seek permission to use their devolved powers. So in order to use their environmental policies when it affects the internal market, they have to go and ask for permission to use those powers. So rather than a default to being able to legislate within your sphere, this requires a greater degree of coordination. And we know that relationships between the UK and Scotland are not always easy. But there's a question of whether this undermines devolution to have to go and seek permission to use those powers. We increasingly see environmental policy as an arena for territorial contestation. So the debates that we see around all sorts of policies, around the broader questions of the future of the Union and the future of Scottish independence, we also see around environmental policy. And we see this as viewed through the lens of the Scottish independence debate, with both governments kind of posturing on these issues because of their constitutional preferences, or as a result of their constitutional preferences. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. And where we see this play out is the bottle deposit scheme, which weirdly became a really contentious issue in the recent leadership debate and the SNP after Nicola Sturgeon's resignation stepped down. There was a very contentious, quite brutal, bruising, and has become increasingly more so leadership debate within the SNP. And this bottle deposit scheme became an issue of contention, partially because of opposition by industry groups, concerns expressed by small retailers, their broader concerns about whether the timing was right, whether the infrastructure was in place to allow the bottle deposit scheme, which was supposed to start quite soon, was whether that was possible, whether it was deliverable within that time frame. You saw varying commitments from leadership candidates to moving that scheme forward or blocking it altogether. But we also see the intervention of the UK government, where they opted not to provide the necessary UK Internal Market Act exemptions to support the scheme. Their rationale was that the permission was not requested in a decent time frame, but also they argued that a UK scheme was coming in shortly, and it would be better for the internal market to have a UK-wide scheme. And what we've seen there is, we've seen as the new Scottish administration took office, we saw the ultimate decision to delay that scheme as a result of the internal controversy, but also as a result of the failure to secure the necessary opt-outs from the Internal Market Act. Great, go ahead, next slide. So the question here is whether you can prevent regulatory fragmentation within the UK, whether you can foster policy cohesion in a post-Brexit UK. From a policy perspective, it's probably better to have a single policy on plastics or a single policy on bottle deposits. It's probably better for producers and for small businesses and manufacturers. But if our priority is policy cohesion, a coherent internal market, at what cost does this come to for political autonomy, rather, and policy innovation? So do we risk reducing the autonomy available to the devolved administrations in the aim of policy cohesion, or do we risk stifling policy innovation because the devolved administrations, who might be able to be a bit more creative, a bit more innovative, or might feel internal pressure to move quicker on these very pressing environmental issues, they might feel like they're not able to do so. So there's a trade-off there, and it's a trade-off that we'll continue to grapple with as we see the post-regulatory frame or post-Brexit framework take place or come online, really. Great, next slide. And then we see issues around Northern Ireland, that the EU Single-Use Plastics Directive should apply to Northern Ireland under the protocol. It's the UK government who is responsible for ensuring that protocol applicable EU laws are implemented. There was a deadline of the 1st of January 2022 for the transposition of that directive. But of course, there's always the challenge of doing so without an executive in Northern Ireland. So we see that the directive hasn't yet been implemented in Northern Ireland. So while we see policy innovation moving forward, adopting policies in Scotland and in Wales, Northern Ireland, of course, lags behind in this area. Great.
And it's back to me. So thank you so much, Coree. And apologies, I think that's me who added another E. I don't know how I did that to your name. It looks good with 3 E's. I think you can pull it off, but I will try to write it correctly in the future. So just to take a step back from this single-use plastic case, it's just like around broader kind of politics, the regulatory politics of this. So from a kind of polycentric governance kind of perspective, or just like thinking about the relationship between the 4 different parts of the UK, single-use plastics in many ways is an example of both competition, conflict, and cooperation. It has it all. So we have competition between the different parts of the UK that are all doing something similar on single-use plastics, but want to be slightly different, with, like Scotland being not just supply, but also production of single-use plastic, Wales being a bit more ambitious with how much plastic is covered. But overall, they're really singing from a relatively same directive hymn sheet. So there is a competition in terms of delivering around that EU directive, even though the 3 parts of the UK that are not bound by it are the one that are actually delivering on it, whereas Northern Ireland is bound by it, it's not. But you do also see cooperation with the Scottish government having managed to obtain, with the support of the Welsh government, that exemption to the UK Internal Market Act principles for single-use plastic. So even though both administrations were very wary and very profoundly opposed to the act, they are trying to make it work in that example. But at the same time, I was there's a question to what extent they are actually trying to make it work or potentially trying to test the limits of the UK Internal Market Act. Now, this in this blog from Davis and the Scottish Spice is kind of Scottish Parliament library kind of service, and they are kind of suggesting there that the Welsh bill on single-use plastics that's agreed in December, passed in December, was kind of drafted in a way to basically test the limits of the UK Internal Market Act. That it is in some ways, the Welsh administrations was hoping, of course, to be able to regulate on single-use plastics, but if at the same time they get kicked back, and it can open up again that debate around UK Internal Market Act and actually have a practical example of how devolution is stifled, well, that's also a bonus. So now what's really interesting in many ways is that it is also extremely problematic from an environmental perspective. This whole idea that we are seeing, the UK Internal Market Act with a very detailed list of exemptions. That means that, this list of single-use plastic is very limited. It doesn't cover a lot of things. It doesn't cover a lot of packaging, for example. And so from an environmental perspective, we want this, we want to be able to kind of respond quickly. And we're not actually in a situation where we'll be able to do that, because we'll have to, first have the different governments perhaps draft something new, and then go back to the UK government to be able to update the exemptions. And that's why, in many ways, I'd argue we're not seeing actually rival simulation within the UK. What we're seeing is, through the operation of the UK Internal Market Act right now, is a new layer of post-Brexit UK red tape that is actually stifling regulatory ambition and regulatory innovation. So the list, again, addressed only a small part of plastic waste. The UK is still playing catch up with that 2019 directive. The EU is already moving forward and is trying to tackle wasteful packaging and make all packaging in the EU market recyclable in economically viable way. That's the kind of thing that the EU is just plowing ahead, and we are still kind of catching up. And that is problematic. It doesn't chime well with the vision that the UK has of itself as an ambitious environmental player. And the fact that we are potentially having to have this kind of reverse dual moment where the devolved administrations are trying to be ambitious, but then have to kind of get approval to do so, and have to have very detailed approval of exactly what needs to be covered, might make sense in terms of making limiting barriers to trade on the UK internal market. But from a kind of nimble regulation, that was what we were promised after Brexit, in terms of, for the environment, the UK will be able to move much quicker, actually doesn't look like that. And that is all for our slides. So I think that's all for our initial presentation from Coree and I. But Emily, if you have any comments, or Coree, if you have any, this is the second half of the webinar now.
Yes, that's great, and I'm happy we have almost a half hour to discuss this. So please go ahead and submit your questions. And I guess I'll start off with one, just to get us going. So I guess my question is sort of about liability and enforcement. So, in the broader context of this, and this is probably like the trade lawyer sort of technical stuff lens coming out, but the one of the objectives of the Internal Market Act, right, is to prevent trade barriers between the UK nations. So my understanding is that, let's take the example of something like the plastic, balloon straws, balloon sticks. Under the mutual recognition principle, Scotland could ban them earlier, but England could still export them to Scotland, and then the exemption allows for Scotland to then ban those from coming into its territory altogether. So that's kind of sort of a comment and a question. If I've got that wrong, let me know. But then I guess the next question I would have is wow, how, who's responsible for enforcing that? I mean, because the whole thing about this is, this has been a big deal in Northern Ireland. We're not going to have border checks in the internal market. we're having a free flowing trade, and maybe if it's just balloon sticks, it's not a big deal. But if there's like a lot of these exemptions, then this question arises of kind of where's the liability? How do you kind of enforce these, border, behind the border, at the border? How do you, obviously we're not going to have border checks at Gretna Green, but how do you make this viable with the sort of enforcement regimes that we have? So I'll start with that question.
Sure. I mean, I think at a basic level, you can't. No one's checking lorries to see if they have contraband balloon sticks in the back. But I guess when you think about what I was uncertain about when the plastics ban came in here in Scotland was how well people knew about it, like how well, I mean, the Pretts and the Cafe Neros are going to know about it, and they adjusted kind of a few months before the actual ban came in. But the small providers, the small cafes, would they have the same information available to them? I think in terms of enforcement, I don't think we don't necessarily have test cases just yet. I'm not quite sure what the procedure is for that regulation, but it is a challenge, because if you order something off of Amazon for your small cafe, if you order a giant box of plastic forks or things like that, no one is checking. There isn't a restriction. There isn't an ability to regulate. So I think there's probably just kind of a hope that that providers might be aware, that consumers are certainly aware of these conversations about plastics, that people might have been moving that direction naturally. I felt like in the kind of 6 to 9 months before that ban came in, you started seeing cafes make that transition. And that might have been driven by their consumers' preferences and their own kind of values as well. But in terms of regulation, it's very difficult.
Just to add to this, I think if you're looking at, so in the Welsh context, so the bill passed, but it hasn't yet, it's not yet an act. So we don't know if the UK government is going to do anything in reaction to it. It's been 5 months, so it's quite a while. But we're seeing already, Welsh businesses, Welsh universities, starting to share information around, oh, by the way, from, if you're organizing a conference, if you're doing something like from September onward, we won't be able to provide you with these kind of items. And so, but they're in a bit of an odd space where it's very hard to make a lot of public information campaign and all of this if you're not completely sure that the bill will actually be published and supported as an act by the UK government. So the other approach that we're seeing is that although theoretically it is a law of the land in Northern Ireland, it's part of the directives that apply as part of the protocol, because it hasn't been transposed. It has definitely not been voluntarily applied by businesses in Northern Ireland. If you get takeaway in Belfast, you will still get single-use plastics. You will still get polystyrene. All of this, even though So I think for me, the Northern Irish example shows that it's not just a natural move towards the end of single-use plastics in that, because businesses are not doing it by themselves. So you do need some clarity. And I think, so this, but because it had been such it's been very high up in terms of environmental politics for quite a while. And the fact that Wales and Scotland are both claiming to be the most ambitious on this, plus you add Blue Planet and all of this, I think there was actually quite a lot of political and just public awareness of that this was coming, apart from Northern Ireland.
Which is ironic, because they're the ones who are mandated to implement the EU regulations. So that's also, I think, a really interesting perspective in terms of how the protocol is functioning in practice. And I also appreciate the perspective about how, compliance with regulation, or behavior change on single-use plastics isn't just come from regulation. It also comes from education. It comes from consumer preferences. It comes from sort of political will. So, and that border enforcement is a very imperfect imperfect art. So I have more questions, but I see we've got one from the floor from Lilia Garcia, and she says, "Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. I missed the first part of the conversation, so apologize if I missed the discussion. How did the China ban play a role in the single plastic policy?"
I'm not actually sure it did. I mean, I think you're right. So the China ban, there's the whole fact that, you know, there's been a lot of pushback on recycling plastic and exporting plastics to be recycled, and the fact that China banned the import of plastic for recycling, being quite aware that actually most of that was not taking place. So I think the China ban is actually critical if you look at what the EU is doing right now in terms of talking about now it has to be about making plastic recyclable at an economic, in a way that is economically viable within the EU. So I think that is definitely critical there. Most of the single-use plastics was just being thrown away anyway. It was not actually being recycled because it was stained. It was, so it's not a question of recycling. It's really a question of just replacing these single-use items by things that are either compostable or that can be reusable, but it's not really moving from a non-recycling to recycling issue. So I think, I mean, the China ban in general has put, you know, I mean, going back to old school UK environmental policy, we had the idea, you know, we're an island, we can just put things out in the sea and it will diffuse and disperse. And in many ways, the EU and the Western world in general was kind of having that approach with plastic. It's just like, sure, we'll gather it and we'll send it elsewhere and it will be recycled out of our hands. And I think, you know, the China ban definitely played a role in making sure that politicians had to do something with this. But I don't think it impacted directly on those single-use plastic items.
Okay, great. So we have another question from Gethin Rees. Apologies, my Welsh is even worse than my French. He says, Mark Drakeford has told the Senate presiding officer that the delay in implementation in Wales is due to needing to give 6 months notice under the royal assent, delayed to June 2023 due to the WTO technical barriers to trade agreement rather than any UK level uncertainty. Any comments from the panel on the interaction with WTO agreements?
I mean, that's one for you, Emily, really.
Yeah.
You're a trade lawyer. What do you think about the link with World Trade Organization? I mean, I think first I'd say this is super interesting because I was really wondering why. My impression was people in Wales were not worried at all about that delay. And I was like, but that's just a very long delay. So it's good to understand why this is happening. I am slightly... I don't think the Scottish bill had 6 months notice for royal assent, and it's very similar. So I'm just surprised that this suddenly is applying to the Welsh case, but not to, you know. So yeah, I'm. It's an interesting explanation, but I'm not sure if it tells us that it's actually that the Welsh and the Scottish cases are treated the same way, because they don't appear to be, to me, still. But Emily, do you have any inkling on how the World Trade Organization technical barriers trade agreement come in?
Well, I mean, I'm very impressed by the commitment in Wales to upholding WTO transparency obligations. I mean, I think, I don't know what's kind of going on under the hood there, but I definitely don't think that it's kind of a standard delay that has to be built into introducing regulations. But yeah, I think
we'll have to look more into this because it's fascinating. And thank you for raising this.
Okay, so the next question is actually oh wait, correct. Sorry, I missed this. I should have said this earlier. Corrected. Oh, never mind. It's the same question, but worded slightly differently. but I think
and you've sent us the letter, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for that letter.
Okay,
that's
good.
Really interesting.
Okay, we'll take a look at that because that is interesting. Okay, so the next question is also the next question I wanted to ask. So, and this is from Daniel Atchison. He says, thanks for the presentation. Can the panel advise on the ability of the EU to enforce a sanction or fine on Northern Ireland for not enforcing the law? As far as I know, there have been many cases historically where member states don't fulfill environmental remits, but then are not hit with the penalty for failing to do so.
So, I mean, I think, it's always a political decision whether the Commission takes up a case or not. There are many infringements of EU law that don't get pursued. The rationale for pursuing some or not is often about, are you going to have a bigger impact? Is it a massive impact on the environment or on the EU internal market? When it comes to Northern Ireland, I think the EU is just wanting the Windsor framework to work, and they're not in a position really where they want to poke the bear more than they have to. I think they just want to move on, and I think they've been very clear as well that they are not that keen into stepping on the toes of the Office for Environmental Protection, for example. We have a new environmental regulator. It will also be up to the OEP to kind of make sure that the law and the environmental law of the land is actually implemented. So I think it is extremely unlikely that the EU would enforce sanction or even fines on Northern Ireland. I mean, those fines anyway would go to the UK, and then the UK government might take the fines from the NI block grant, but the signatory to the treaty is the UK, it's not Northern Ireland. So I think it is extremely unlikely. But what's interesting is that what we've seen is this kind of back and forth between then Edwin Poots, who was the Minister for Agriculture and the Environment, and he basically said it's not, the Assembly doesn't have to do this. It's a DEFRA, it should be DEFRA passing a statutory instrument to implement the directive for Northern Ireland. It's to do with the protocol is a UK-EU agreement. It's nothing to, we're not bound by, we're affected by it, but we're not one of the party to the agreement. And what is surprising to me is that, we don't need a sitting assembly for Westminster to pass SIs that apply to Northern Ireland. So in many ways, it is DEFRA and the UK government that have dropped the ball completely on single-use plastics in Northern Ireland. And they could have done it ages ago, and they should have done it ages ago.
I think that's what strikes me as being interesting about the situation is that it's not a member state per se. So it's just also a question of sort of whose responsibility, who has responsibility for implementing what the EU requires in Northern Ireland, and how does that happen? So I guess I'll ask another question unless, Coree, did you want to jump in?
No.
So I'm just interested in kind of, your account of what seems to be all these, as you say, the countries are more or less moving in the same direction, but they're kind of doing things slightly differently and it's slightly different timescales. And I understand Scotland has a clear rationale for this in terms of EU alignment. But as for sort of Wales and England, is it a case of kind of doing things differently for the sake of being different? Is it a case of just everyone has their own internal regulatory process and then they just don't talk to each other? What kind of accounts for these differences, do you think?
I think it's a mix of both. I think there's a political imperative or a political dynamic where you want to say this is policy made in Wales, this is policy made in Scotland, even if it doesn't look massively different from policies made elsewhere or they're coming down the track in England. Perhaps a reluctance to wait on England given the kind of upheaval at the UK government level. But it's not unique to environmental policy. We saw this with kind of public health initiatives. We saw this with smoking bans. So it's devolved institutions using their devolved powers and showing that they can and will use those powers. I think there's probably a kind of protectiveness over those devolved powers, that we need to use them. We need to not fall into line because there's a perception that perhaps devolution is a bit under threat, or at least the powers might be kind of scaled back in some way by too much cooperation with the UK government. When they do cooperate, and they can cooperate, we know they're capable of it. But there is a tendency to say what we do ourselves, we do better, which I think is not a SNP motto. It's a Flemish nationalist motto. But there's an emphasis on making our own policies tailored to Scotland, tailored to Wales, even if they're not, they're in response to the same challenges, they're in response to the same imperatives. So I think there's a strong political dynamic at play there. And we see this in how intergovernmental relations works in the UK, where there is quite a bit of posturing. There's a desire for distinctiveness, but that's a product of devolution. We saw that in the early years of devolution, even under different party governments, where there was a rush to policy.
And I completely agree with what Coree just said. I think it's also really interesting to see how, so first I think the civil servants talk to each other through the common framework system and all that. So, if there's a policy that is going to be developed in one part of the UK, usually, they'll be aware. Now, we've heard through the Brexit process that in some of these cases, that official sharing of the draft happens a day before or something, So there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of smoothing sometimes fraught relations. But at the same time, it does seem like, if you look at the communication from the different governments, it looks like all of them are world leading. All of them are doing something completely ambitious and no one has ever done before. Now, it is slightly less the case as this time around in the English policy for banning things from October. They're not actually making these big claims. They're just calling it far-reaching. But it is actually, there's no mention on the gov.uk website the fact that this is already in place in Scotland. This has already been passed for Wales. This is actually in line with the Single-Use Plastics Directive that the UK government decided not to implement. So because it had been passed in 2019, but for implementation just around Brexit time. So around it's the ban in the EU would be from July 2021. So the idea was the UK had the option to implement it, decided not to, decided to do something completely different. And in doing something completely different, they've actually done the same thing. And we're seeing that happening throughout in a lot of different policy areas. And that's for lots of different reasons. First, because sometimes, it just takes a lot of time to develop an alternative. You just if you have a pretty good enough reason that has convinced 27 member states and has jumped through all the regulatory hoops at EU level, there's a good chance it's a pretty good shot and good way of doing it. And, and we just don't necessarily have the time and energy or just focus to just decide to suddenly do something completely different on every policy area. It's just, it's better to just, you already have an off-the-shelf solution to this, let's do it. And I think we are seeing this a lot, and that kind of test of what do we mean by regulatory freedom. Sometimes regulatory freedom is just being quite happy and okay with being just copying your neighbors. That way you just don't have to start from scratch. But that's the kind of discussion we're still having, taking us back to the Retain EU Law Revocation and Reform Bill around, is an idea terrible just because it comes from the EU?
Yeah, I think that maybe the part of it is of needing to make these small changes is just kind of being drunk on the power of being able to set your own regulations in this area for the first time. But I think that kind of that what you just said really, to me, strikes at the heart of the kind of the conundrum facing, facing devolved nations right now in terms of the UK's future regulatory direction. And so I guess my final question, and I think this will probably pick up on some of what you were going to say initially in your first plan on retained EU law, is, what happens if one of the nations really does go radical and decide, hey, you know what, we're going to rip up the rule book in 600 ways, and we're going to just, completely change everything. So kind of, highlighting the kind of stresses and frictions in the internal market framework that you've highlighted. Let's do the thought experiment, kind of what becomes of the internal market in this scenario.
I think, for a lot of the question is which nation is doing it, because the powers of England versus the powers of the other nations are not the same. So in a way, I think England and the UK government could get away with it to a much greater extent than the others. But also it's just a question of market size. So, the English market is so much bigger than anything else that it'd be very unlikely that suddenly people would start producing to this new highly deregulated Welsh standard, across the UK. I think there's like that kind of would move all production to Wales to avail themselves of the fact that now you have 50 hours work week in Wales instead of 48. That's, but in many ways we don't know, because of course this hasn't been possible at all. What I would expect though is, and that's why people were really worried about the retained EU law revocation and reform bill, is that it was giving power to ministers to cut this. And so there was very little role for stakeholders' involvement, very little role for Parliament. So I think the expectation is that if you have ministers that come up and say, let's free business and cut all of these rules in my little part of the UK, the expectation is that business will say, actually, it doesn't help us. Please don't do that. And the only way it goes through is if you have only the executive at a very specific moment of time just having lots of power and be able to do it. As long as you have this kind of normal democratic society and ways of agreeing policy, I think we're pretty safe from wild bonfire of regulations. But it's an interesting thought experiment.
I'm going to quote you on that, Viviane. Okay, Coree, do you want the final word?
Sure. I think you have, going back to this idea of devolved powers, I think if there was an attempt, there's obviously a desire for more progressive or more radical environmental policy in Scotland and in Wales, but there is a constraint of the inability of the devolved governments to go too far, based on the fact that they need the statutory implement, they need this permission from Westminster to use those devolved powers. So even if if they could make a political case for it and an economic rationale for it and a policy case for it, they would also need the consent of the UK government.
Great. Well, it reminds me of that good slogan, what do we want? Gradual change. When do we want it? In due course.
Definitely.
I will quote you on that.
So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you to our presenters. I learned a lot of things that I probably should have known already, so that's going to help me a lot going forward. And I'm looking forward to a lot of future conversations on this topic with you both and with others. So take care, everyone.